All right, everyone. Just kind of going to be going over the last day of Gettysburg. Quick recap is Chamberlain ends up being the victor of day two, a little round top. Chamberlain and his men of Maine. So we kind of see a swing in things. Day one is kind of won by the Confederates. They wanted to push forward. Lee stopped them. Then day two, we see Lee as well as Hood and Longstreet attempt to take the vantage point at Little Round Top and Cemetery Ridge, and they are stopped by Chamberlain and his men of Maine. And then day three is basically an absolute collapse by the Confederates. We see probably the most famous charge of any charge in U.S. history until probably World War II, known as Pickett's Charge. So Pickett was an infantry officer. He was ordered by the Confederate General Robert E. Lee against George Meade's Union position, Cemetery Ridge, on July 3rd, 1863. So a day before the 4th of July, kind of crazy. Last day of the Battle of Gettysburg in the state of Pennsylvania during the American Civil War. After the Confederates attacked on both the Union flanks, they had failed the day and the night before. Lee was determined to strike the Union center on the third day. On the strike, on the night of July 2nd, Meade correctly predicted this council of the war, and Lee would try and attack on his lines and center following the morning. So basically, bottom line is Meade ends up kind of having a hunch. They say, or the night of, he had like a dream or an epiphany, I guess you might want to say, where he believed that Lee was going to attack up the center. And by Lee attacking up the center, that would be Pickett attacking up the center. So what he ends up doing is basically focusing all his power, mortars, cannons, soldiers for the most part, on the center at Pickett. So when Pickett ends up starting the charge at the beginning of the day, there's this long barrage of cannon fire mortars by the Confederacy, and then we have a return barrage by the Union forces. Once the smoke is kind of there, Pickett ends up charging with his men up the center. The bad part about this charge is where Pickett is actually charging. If you guys were ever able to go to Gettysburg, it's this slow kind of incline up. So again, the Union have the vantage point. So as the smoke clears, the men of the Union Army and Meade's men, George Meade's men, see Pickett and his infantry group basically running up front, and then they basically send a barrage of fire on Pickett's men. At a point, Pickett breaks where Meade's lines are, but he's soon basically pushed back. Pickett never is given the backup or the reinforcements that he needed to fully engage in this battle, and the Confederates lose. It's the first time that Lee actually hesitates, and through this hesitation, Pickett loses basically his entire army. At the end of this war, at the end of this battle, and even the war, Pickett constantly picks a fight with Lee and says that it was his fault that this battle ended up falling apart and that the Confederates lost. So the infantry assault was preceded by a massive artillery bombardment that we kind of just talked about. Approximately 12,500 men in 9 infantry brigades advanced over open field, which is never smart, right? Okay, if you're in an open field, you hear that constant term like shooting a fish in a barrel. It's quite easy to pick people off, and that's exactly what ends up happening. The Union artillery ended up firing on these men, and a vast majority of them go down before they even reach the Union lines. Although some Confederates were able to breach the low stone wall, and it was shielded by many of the Union defenders, they would not be able to maintain or hold and repulse this charge. 50% of the casualties that ended up happening over Gettysburg was on this third day. So Lee's campaign is basically over here. The Union Army is going to win the war. And Lee never rebounds from this, which is pretty awful. So when we look at the casualties, while the Union lost 1,500 men, Confederates' casualty rate was over 50%. Okay, so Pickett's division, if we look specifically at his numbers, 2,655 casualties, 498 killed, 643 wounded, 833 wounded and captured, 681 captured, unwounded. Thus, the total losses in this attack, not even looking at Pickett's men, around 6,555, which at least 1,123 Confederates were killed on the battlefield. 4,019 were wounded, and in those who were wounded, most of them would end up dying. So this is what Pickett's charge looked like. You have the Union Army here. You see the Confederate forces kind of coming up the center. Just wasn't a good look. Now, to kind of end Gettysburg, I talked to you guys a little bit about this as I started the Gettysburg Prezi. The unfortunate thing about Gettysburg is it didn't just affect the men that fought there. It affected the town. Gettysburg is the only national park in which you have a city on that people live in. And you have businesses, things like that. Gettysburg doesn't recover from this battle for years. Not only are they using their own grave diggers, but people within the city are coming out and trying to help people find bodies. They have to basically get other grave diggers, morticianers from neighboring cities to come in to help them out. They would run rampant with disease. As these morticians and grave diggers were coming to Gettysburg, they could smell the stench from miles away. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers who came to Gettysburg to try to collect the dead and collect their loved ones were, just astonished by the sheer carnage. The dirt and the mud and the grass were stained with blood for years and years to come. We have if you guys ever go to Gettysburg, you go to Gettysburg Cemetery. Gettysburg Cemetery, before this war, was actually at a lower point. By lower point, I mean like the dirt level was lower. By the time Gettysburg ends up ending and the bodies are finally buried, Gettysburg Cemetery exceeds this point by, I want to say, like it's like 10 or 12 feet higher than previously. We also see some unmarked tombs if you ever go to Gettysburg Cemetery, and that's because many of these individuals that died in the Battle of Gettysburg over the 3-day course, some of them were never able to be found or be able to brought to their formal resting place by their family because their bodies were so disfigured. They didn't know who was who. It's just a very, very sad and somber 3 days. And from this, we get the Gettysburg Address that you guys read and did an assignment on, which, shows even Lincoln's few words that he speaks that day. Another individual ends up speaking that day as well, and he talks for over 2 hours. He's a university professor, and after this university professor speaks, Lincoln speaks, and his message is only around 2 to 3 minutes long, but it remains in the hearts of Americans forever. It's probably one of the most famous speeches of all time when it comes to American history. So from the Battle of Gettysburg, here's some things to kind of reflect on. Day 1 is won by the Confederates. Day 2 and 3 are won by the Union. It is the turning point, the most pivotal point of the war. After the Union and Meade ends up getting revenge on Lee from his previous early encounters with Lee. After the Union, wins this battle, Lee is never able to basically come back from this, and the Confederates lose, and that's history.